Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about redefining normal to find an identity. I'm going to be using Curwood's article and Mockingbird. When we had to read Curwood for class, I couldn't help but think about what does redefining normal mean? Because, the article is called Redefining Normal, a critical analysis of disability, and dis is in parentheses, so looking at what makes something an ability and then what makes something the opposite of that, a disability, in young adult literature specifically. And so at the very beginning, Curwood talks about the constructions of normalcy, so how disability is constructed in society. And that's a direct quote, and it just means that our perceptions and stereotypes of disabilities are created and then accepted and then further perpetuated through time, through narratives, meaning stories from movies, from books, from word of mouth, etc. Just our general way of sharing information, whether it's for fun or for education, oftentimes a little bit of both, like with fairy tales. And so keeping in mind that the way we're thinking of normalcy is constructed. It's not that there was always a correct standard, but that someone, some group, some dominant group, based on all the people in that little village or little society, whatever, has been, constructed based on what they experienced around them. So then there would be the binary of normal and not normal. You can't have one without the other. And Curwood explains that teachers may need to reframe our understanding of disability, identity, and equality on page 16 for students, because they might not understand that these are constructions. They might just think of them as just a given, that this is just how it is. And so that word reframe is really important in her article. And this reframing comes from critical literacy, the ability to analyze, critique, and transform the norms, rules, and practices that govern our daily lives. You can find that quote on page 18. So before you can reframe, you really need to think about critical literacy and how we actively engage with the texts around us. Like I said, whether it's in a film or someone you actually know or in a book. Because these narratives that are being perpetuated around us, they're determining our daily lives. And we need to reframe how we're thinking about it. And so framing is something that's already been established. If you're thinking about the framing of a house, the framing goes up after foundation, after a design has been laid. So reframing means we need to build a different kind of house, right? So like a different kind of understanding. I know that's a really odd analogy, but I'm just going to go with it. And I think that's what Caitlin does in Mockingbird. Like, of course, it's not her fault that she has Asperger's. That's a mental disorder that, she was born with, that she grew up with, but her story shows how her perspective allows students to reframe their understanding of mental disorders. So beyond just depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder, you have Asperger's, which has its own triggers and its own influences and its own elements that make it unique. And so Caitlin is a unique perspective of Asperger's. She's not the standard for it. She's not the voice for all. This is specifically through her perspective. And I think Curwood would like that because she's talking about reframing. So she's talking about looking at things differently anyway, not from the norm. And so Caitlin's a really good example of reframing the constructions of normalcy. Like I said, she has Asperger's, and on page 22, she explains how people struggle to understand her, and so she has to work extra hard to understand them. And that struggle really comes from emotions. It's very abstract. It's not tangible. It's not something that you can systematically label and see and feel in some ways and describe. It's different from her. She doesn't fit in with society. She is not part of the normal spectrum. She sticks out. She's abnormal. She's outside the normal frame of behavior. So thinking about reframing, I think that language is important. And so Caitlin's very literal. That's where her Asperger's comes in. She struggles to adapt to the social codes that are already set in place in society because she doesn't get it, the capital G and the capital I. She knows her own normalcy, but knows it's not everyone else's normal. And she breaks away from standardization and redefines it. She reframes it and creates her own identity through her disability. Instead of letting it hold her back, she works with it in her own world because that's all she knows. And some different things that came to mind when I was thinking of standardization. So in order to reframe what's normal, what's been created as a construct, you have to think about the standard, what she's working with. So she uses an actual standardized dictionary, that's a standard of language, for definitions because she finds comfort in her understanding of the literal meaning of things. You can see that on page 25. It's among the list of things that make her comfortable when she's meeting with a therapist. And so she also capitalizes the beginning of words in a non-standard way as a means of making sense of things around her. These phrases are usually related to themes in her life. So you have when she gets it, or tantrum, rage, meltdown. Each one of these words, the beginning, starting with a capital letter, the day our life fell apart, closure. They all represent some theme or major event in her life, and she uses her own version of standardization here with language to make it make sense in this world that's chaotic for her as she exists on the abnormal part of the spectrum. And she wonders why teachers get to decide which words are more special than others on page 77, specifically wondering about Devin's heart with a capital H. It's huge for her. It's all part of closure. And she doesn't understand why her rules aren't the normal rules. Who decided this? And she also follows the existing codes as best as she can. I'm thinking of the feeling chart with the facial expressions. She even says on page 41, I wish people would follow the facial expressions chart like they're supposed to. And facial expressions charts capitalize, like a proper noun, but also it's a big theme. It's a big marker for her understanding of things. This is how she's reading other people. This is crucial to her. She uses the dictionary to explain things to herself and other people, but this is how she's reading the people around her. And then with your manners versus my manners, you remember when she's learning what that really means, and she says, oh, thank you, you're very helpful. I think it'll be easier to learn your manners, my manners, now that I know they belong to me, and I'm not trying to learn somebody else's. So she's aware of this trouble of being in a society where they govern the rules. She draws when she can't emote verbally, and she's actually very good. And she draws in black and white because colors are really difficult for her to navigate. She says they get blurry and mushy, but she also purposefully makes things mushy and blurry by stuffed animaling them. It's how she's navigating in her society. And she counts things. So everything with Caitlin is about systems and order and livable rules so that she can avoid confusion and chaos. Caitlin's world is not like the majority's. She even says, I can be in my own Caitlin world on page 19. But she tries to come out of hers to learn to have finesse and empathy. And few people work as hard as she does to exist on her level as she does to exist in theirs. And Mockingbird allows a nice view inside to see that a disability doesn't mean that you can't interact in society. It just means that you have different roles. And it's a good look at people who even don't have like a classified disability, that some people exist with different roles and different morals and perspectives. And it's all about inclusion. Like, they're inclusionary texts because we're reframing these narratives of our lives that we have been living by based on what someone else has already said.